Flying Tigers began as an innovation to the transportation industry. An all-cargo airline had never existed before. But the idea had probably been incubating during the latter part of World War II in the mind of this man, Robert W. Prescott. Prescott had been part of a spirited bunch of aviators called the American Volunteer Group, or AVG. Under the command of General Claire Chennault, these young daredevils, known as the Flying Tigers, flew their P-40s over Burma and China, protecting the supply lines on the Burma Road from Japanese attack. Prescott also flew military cargo missions over the Himalayas, or the Hump as it was called, from India to Burma and China. Following the war, the bright but jobless Prescott seized an opportunity to put his flying experience to use. A man by the name of Samuel B. Mosier was looking for a way to move perishable items between Mexico and the U.S. Prescott convinced Mosier that such a job could best be done by airplane. Prescott then proceeded to persuade a handful of his former flying buddies to join him in an exciting new enterprise. With matching funds from Mosier, Prescott and his friends managed to scrounge up enough money to begin the nation's first all-cargo airline.
Well, we all had invested our earnings from overseas, and so we were determined that it would succeed. And we worked very, very hard. We did everything that was necessary to keep it going.
On June 25, 1945, the National Skyway Freight Corporation, subtitled The Line of the Flying Tigers, was born. With a fleet of former Navy cargo planes called Bud-Conestogas, the new organization made its headquarters in a two-car garage at Long Beach Airport in California.
Pilots, mechanics, even the gals from the office would help load and take off freight.
Well, we washed floors, did janitorial work, washed the airplanes, serviced the airplanes, until we got to the point where we had sufficient personnel to do all that.
The first shipments were loads of grapes, flowers, and furniture. The airline was in business.
Well, we'd stop at every airport, and in the beginning we flew flowers west to east, which was a natural, and some fruit. And then also from the East Coast, mainly it was furniture, kind of like a moving van, a moving line. But also, when we were empty, and we were empty a great share of the time, we would go around and try to find passengers in the crowded terminals, and then we'd offer them a good deal, much less than the airfare, and we'd usually get a few, from a handful to maybe a dozen, or sometimes 2 dozen people to fly with us. And so that supported us and paid for the expenses and gasoline.
The fledgling company struggled for survival during those early days, since shipments were scarce and the bills were piled high.
There were a few times that Bob Prescott came down and says, "Hey, we don't have enough money. Here's your check, but don't cash it for about 2 weeks."
And we were so hard up for money in those days, we used to lock the phone at night so they wouldn't be calling all over. We couldn't afford them to use the phone. When they had to file their flight plan, they had to go someplace else and file it.
It was the military that helped bail out the airline when a large group of sailors chartered planes to get home to New York. This was the first in a long succession of chartered passenger flights that kept revenue flowing when freight loads diminished. A year after the airline began, the Buds were replaced by a fleet of C-47s. The C-47s were later supplemented with a fleet of C-54s. Most of the planes were provided by the military, when in 1946, the Tigers received a contract to supply the U.S. occupational forces in Japan. At about the same time, Prescott moved the headquarters to Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank, California. The airline's name was officially changed to the Flying Tiger Line. But Tigers spent about as much time in hearing rooms as it did in the air. The company fought long and hard, trying to get certified by the now defunct Civil Aeronautics Board to fly cargo on a regularly scheduled basis. In 1949, the airline was awarded full certification serving Route 100 from Los Angeles to Boston with points in between. It was the first transcontinental air freight certificate ever awarded.
It was the first major step of being fully recognized as a certificated freight carrier. And as you know, that route number is 100, which we were the first in it and became the world's largest.
In an effort to drive the Tigers out of business, the established airlines began their own freight operations.
But the majors had not particularly gone into the freight business, but practically all of them did so after we were starting to become successful.
And airlines like American, Pan Am, TW, they were all doing everything in their power to put us out of business. You know, we had a fleet of 16 C-54s and a bunch of 46s, a couple of dozen of those. And Pan Am was trying to ground our C-46s. And we did all kinds of things to keep the CAA, which was then FAA, was FAA now, from grounding the airplanes, and we were successful. We stayed in business.
From the beginning, resourcefulness and innovation were the Flying Tigers' code. Back when the Bud's exhaust pipes kept falling off, Tiger mechanics invented and forged a special wrench to solve the problem. Flying Tigers pioneered the shipment of racehorses between tracks, designing and building specially constructed stalls and custom-built ramps.
At that time, we didn't have any powered rolling systems or manual loading systems in the airplane. They were all just bulk loaded in what we call bulk loading. And we would walk the animals up a ramp into the airplane and stall them in stalls that we had positioned on the floor previously.
Our maintenance wizards developed a movable refrigeration device to pre-chill an airplane for shipment of perishables. They later designed a built-in refrigeration system for the C-47. Another innovation revolutionized the shipment of clothing. Garments were hung on overhead tubing that followed the contours of the plane. The passenger charter business began to boom in the late 40s and early 50s. Tigers introduced the concept of high-density seating, expanding the DC-4's capacity from 40 to over 100 for special flights. In 1950, with a fleet of C-46s, Tigers was the first to offer low-cost transatlantic tourist service. The Immigration Service awarded Flying Tigers a large contract for transporting illegal Mexican farm workers back to Mexico from the U.S. When the Korean conflict broke out, Flying Tigers was the first to place a civilian plane into service. Instrumental in supporting U.S. forces in Korea, Tigers was the largest military freight and passenger contractor in the Pacific. When Tigers flew Korean war orphans to the States, Tiger Maintenance again showed their ingenuity when they built special cradles designed to lay across folded aircraft seats.
We had all the babies on board, and they were all infants and no adults, and it was a very busy trip, to say the least, but very rewarding when you got to Seattle and see the parents pick up their children.
Tigers also participated in the airlift of 35,000 near-starving Jewish Yemenites from the Arabian Desert to the new state of Israel. In 1955, the CAB renewed Tiger's certificate for Route 100, which allowed the airline to haul mail and air express shipments. From 1955 to 1957, Tigers flew construction crews and supplies to the Arctic for the building of the North American Distant Early Warning System, the DEW Line.
We were operating C-54s and 46s up there. And although very critical conditions in flying, all they had at the end of, and mind you, these little runways were chopped out of the snow or on a frozen lake, and they either had Christmas trees that he had cut and stacked along the runway, so you could see, or they had red fuel barrels. But they had things called whiteout. And you could fly over and look down and see the runway, but yet when you got down to 500 feet and come into land, you couldn't see the runway.
It was very difficult to tell the horizon or the sky from the land because it's all white, and so not much of a horizon as such. and they were landing on ice fields, and it was very hazardous flying, but the fellows did a marvelous job.
Flying Tigers was expanding and setting records, due in large part to the efforts of its people.
But it was great days, and I think all of the boys had that spirit. The maintenance people, the accounting people, the flight people.
I think it is probably best summed up by Bob Prescott. If you can bring it to the gate, we will fly it.
We used to sleep right in the hangar, and sometimes we'd have so much work to do that we converted a maintenance shop area that we had, and we had all of the bins where they used to store the spare parts, and we made those our bunks. And on there we'd have what time that we worked and what time we wanted to be woken for the next flight.
We took on projects that maybe many of us didn't have the experiences in the particular line, be it either in sales and maintenance and managing or what have you, or taking on particular projects that other airlines would perhaps consider, have a lot of meetings on, and then may not elect to go ahead with the plan.
If you didn't do it, and I cannot think of any example that we did not do it, it reflected on Bob, and you were the last person in the world to want to give Bob Prescott a bad name. If Bob says we can do it, we can do it.
Flying Tigers acquired a fleet of 15 Super Constellations, Connies, and inaugurated non-stop coast-to-coast air freight service in a record time of 8 hours. Tiger Maintenance redesigned the Connies into convertibles, which gave them the capability of hauling freight or passengers. In the passenger configuration, Tigers set a single-trip record across the North Atlantic with 114 passengers. This was later increased with careful engineering.
So what I did, I staggered the triple seats, because if you put them side by side, you ended up with a 13-inch aisle, and you had to have 14. By staggering them so that the seat was opposite of where you sat in the other side, we were able to get a 14-inch aisle, and we got 10 more seats in the airplane.
Transporting 70,000 travelers in 1957, the Connies gave Tiger's group charter business a tremendous boost. The 60s proved to be another decade of record-setting and innovation. In 1961, Tigers took delivery of a fleet of planes specifically designed for hauling freight, the CL-44 Swingtails. These aircraft were faster, more powerful, had a longer range, and carried a third more freight than the Connies. The tail would swing aside, allowing cargo to be loaded directly into the cabin, eliminating the usual side door jockeying. The deck floor was equipped with rollers, allowing a new concept in loading: palletized cargo for easier handling. Along with the Swingtails, Flying Tigers introduced its first automated cargo terminal in Chicago, Illinois. The innovations continued in 1962, when Flying Tigers began the first coordinated combination sea and air transportation service. This service, called Sea Tiger, became a viable and important part of our business.
In fact, allows us to take traffic by ocean from Japan to the port of Los Angeles, put it on a truck or an airplane to the gateway city of New York, and transport that to one of Flying Tiger's cities in Europe or South America, and have it all on one bill of lading, and allow the customer to deal with Flying Tigers at destination or origin and be able to track that shipment all the way through.
The 1960s also saw Tigers entering the jet age with the acquisition of Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 aircraft. The jets were placed into service on the Trans-Pacific route, supplying our U.S. military forces in Vietnam.
Flying Tigers was really